Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and today I'm going to make a Cult of the Lamb lamp. A Cult of the Lamp, if you will. Of course, if it's going to be a lamp, then we need some lights. My plan, in as far as I have a plan, is to make my mutton floating above a pool of spicy red sauce with bright glowing eyes. Now, to make those eyes glow, I'm going to solder together a couple of red LEDs, which I can then encase in clay and wire to a battery pack later. By starting with the eyes, I can get a good idea of how large the head will be and then build everything else to fit that scale. Otherwise, the LEDs stuck together and bent into shape, I can get to building the head, starting by mixing up a batch of black and purple lambskin clay. I'll be sure to make some extras so that I don't need to try and color match later, then it's just a case of bulking out the wires and the LEDs until I've got a sorta game accurate head. I don't know what the maximum operating temperature of these LEDs are, but I've made a few past projects with LEDs embedded in clay and they seem to have turned out fine. There is of course every possibility that baking LEDs releases some sort of invisible, poisonous vapor into the air, significantly reducing my lifespan, but if that's the case then at least it means I don't need to plan for retirement. Otherwise, once I've achieved a horrifying purple cuboid alien head, I'll carve out a breathing hole in the lower half of his head, and then a lump of red clay will be his tongue, and a strip of translucent white clay will be his teeth. I'm gonna make his eyes using a couple big balls of translucent clay. This stuff will cure to a semi-opaque white, hiding the LEDs, but because they're translucent, they'll act as a diffuser, turning bright red when the LEDs are switched on. Finally, before I bake the head for the first time and hope that the wiring doesn't melt, I'll stick a couple cones to the side of his head to make his ears. And then, once the head's been cured in the oven and is nice and hard, I can remove the wooden block, drill a hole in the bottom, then stick a length of armature wire into the base, which I can wrap the exposed electrical wiring around, and then tape down with a bit of blue tape. I don't think I'm going to be able to make my lamb float and hide the wire at the same time, but I've got a plan to fake that later. For now though, I'll just bend the wire so that it's out of the way, attach the electrical wiring, then mount it on a block so I can build the rest of the body. Before I make the body though, I need to finish the head. I'll start by covering everything but the face in a pile of white wool clay, then hammering it with a ball stylus to give it a bit of a fluffy, woolly look. Then I can build up the center part of my lamb's hair before getting to work making his horns and hat. The horns I'll make by rolling out a tapered wormy dealie of dark red clay, then cutting a spiral shape along the length. I'll then bake the horns in the oven to set them so that I can press them firmly into the still soft white wool. To make the crown, I'll wrap a little metal tube in black clay, then cut the ends flush, chop out the 4 peaks of the crown, mark out the space for the eyeball, then throw it in the oven. Once it's been hardened, I can peel it off my little tube, press a little blob of red clay into the eye socket, add a tiny black slit, then press the crown into place. I'll bake the head once more to cure the clay and then get to work building the rest of the body. I'm going to build up the body using some more white clay followed by that tried and true hammering texture, then I can poke a couple divots onto the sides for his arms and legs. I'll roll out a long wormy dealie of purplish black clay, then cut it into 4 roughly even little tubes. The first of these tubes will get rolled into slightly tapered worms of clay, with a pair of little hooves cut into the tip, then stuck into place on the bottom of the lamb. The arms start out as similarly shaped worms, but I'll flatten the tip and cut a trio of tiny fingers before adding a thumb. Then they get stuck onto the side divots and positioned in a satanic, come at me bro pose. Now to finally cover all that exposed wiring, I'm going to stick to the old classic spooky tentacles. The real trick here is going to be positioning the tentacles in such a way that it doesn't trigger Rule 34 artists or make it look like our lamb is being propped up like a sock puppet. Basically, I don't want to give anyone the wrong idea, so I'm going to make sure the tip of the tentacle is clearly visible. Mostly because I know what kind of weirdos watch my channel, and while I love you, I don't want to encourage you. Otherwise, with the shape of the tentacles figured out, I can give it a little extra texture along the outside before adding a whole bunch of gnarly knobbly suction cups. To make the lamb's fleece cape thing, I've smashed a ball of red clay flat, then cut a little neck hole out before chopping it up to give me a multi-pointed red poncho. Finally, I'll add a little trim around the edge which I can paint white later, then I'll peel my poncho off the plastic and place it perfectly upon my possessed lamb. Then I can add a long black wormy dealy collar, prop up the back side of his poncho with a bit of wire to keep it fluttering while it bakes, then add his little golden bell and he's ready for his final bake in the oven. Which means our main character is done and it's time to make that aforementioned bubbling puddle of red mystery liquid. However, before we can get to the bubbling pool of cursed strawberry jam, we need to make a mold. Enter Monster Clay. This is a wax-based clay that is soft in the heat and very hard at room temperature, which means it's ideal for making my mold. Once I've rolled out a big ball of Monster Clay into a personal pan pizza-sized slab, I'll use an MDF block to cut out a perfect circle. Once I've cleaned up the edges a bit, I can mark out the lines of my pentagram, not worrying too much about being super accurate with the shape. It's more just for flavor and a little added texture, since once the lights are turned on, you won't really be able to see it anyways. I rolled out a long flat worm of clay that I can then cut an interesting and random, squiggly, sorta bubbly, flamey look to, then attach this around the perimeter of the pentagram. I'll wrap an extra long wormy dealy around the lip between the flames and the base and then blend these two sections together, and then I can use my ball styluses to add lots of swirls and waves and interesting textures to the flames. Finally, to help smooth the rough edges and give it a bit more of a liquid look, it's time to use one of my favorite sculpting tools, fire. The fire will melt the clay, removing any of the sharp lines, leaving me with a softer, smoother surface. Plus, it adds a layer of danger not usually associated with sculpting. Then I can use my freshly cured tentacle lamb to indent his place in the portal, then do the same thing with a couple extra tentacles I made off camera before smashing the flat of the base with my ball stylus to give it a bit of a watery look. Now, I realized that this looks like a similar method for making the wool look fluffy, but I assure you that this is an entirely different method with an entirely different outcome. Otherwise, I'll add some finishing touches by way of little bubbles on top, then I can start constructing a fancy cardboard frame. I'm going to be making my mold out of silicone, and it's pretty viscous stuff, so a cheap and cheerful cardboard frame is more than enough. This is a two-part silicone that gets mixed in equal portions, has a working time of about 30 minutes, and sets in about 3 hours. By pouring from a higher height, I'll get a long stream which will limit the amount of bubbles in the final mold. Then it's just a case of waiting the required 3 hours and I'm ready to pop out my chocolate summoning circle. Now, I hadn't quite poured enough to cover some of the taller peaks, so I pressed a little piece of foam into the center to help raise the base up a bit. Otherwise, all I need to do is pull the frame apart and pull the chocolate portal out, and then I'm ready to mix up some resin. I don't know what the portal is made out of, so I'm going to assume that it's made of cherry and lavender jam, since those are the two reddest tints that I have. I also topped it off with a little red ink since I wanted it to be a bit more opaque. Then I can pour it into the mold, making sure to agitate the deeper sections to help release any of the stubborn bubbles. Then I'll fill it right to the lip and set it aside for 48 hours while I wait for the resin to cure. In the meantime though, let's build a stone circle. Now the first step, of course, is going to be turning my square into a circle. And there you have it, one not quite perfect foam circle. As for all the offcuts, I'm going to gather them up and set them aside for later. I've measured out the size of the summoning circle, then used the circle cutter to mark out what needs to be removed. Then I'll cut out a thinner sheet of foam to sit underneath to house the lights and wiring. Before I get to work texturing and painting though, I want to make sure that I cut a channel on the bottom for the main lighting, and then a small house for the smaller battery pack that will light up the lamb's eyes. Finally, I've got a few holes to fill, so I'll fill those in with some hole filler. I ended up texturing the sides anyway, so this was kind of a pointless step, but every second of video increases my view time and pleases the algorithm gods. Otherwise, it's time to apply that texture. Which leads me to my favorite technique, bashing with rocks. Now, no stone summoning circle is complete without a circle of stones, so I'm going to grab those offcuts I gingerly set aside earlier and start shaving them down to more stone-shaped chunks of foam. I'll start by cutting away some of the sharp corners and straight edges to get a bit more of a natural looking shape. Then to soften up some of the edges and give them a less uniform looking shape, I'll throw them into an overpriced coffee canister, fill it with rocks, then shake the shit out of it. And after a few minutes, I'm left with these pretty smart looking little foam stones. Then all I need to do is carve some satanic symbols into the face of the stones, and I can start gluing them around the top of the stone circle. Finally, to prime and seal the foam, I like to coat it with a layer of Mod Podge and black paint. Once that dries, I can apply a base coat of stone gray to the stones until they're gray, and then apply a heavy black wash over the entire surface before dabbing away any of the excess. I'll follow that with a series of dry brushes, I'll follow that with a series of progressively warmer and lighter grays that I'll dry brush over all the edges. And then once everything is dry, I'll realize I shouldn't have added the stones, so I'll carefully pull them all off again. Why am I pulling them all off? Because I wanted to add some grass in this circle, and to try to add that between the stones without covering them is more of a faff than just pulling them off in advance. But what it really means is that it's my favorite flocking thing in the world. Static grass. Seriously, this stuff is the tits, and it's probably the closest that I'm gonna come these days to touching real grass. Now, how do you apply static grass? With a static grass applicator, of course. You can absolutely apply static grass without one of these things, but then you lose the static part of the static grass and it just kind of becomes grass. Basically, the applicator shocks these little guys into standing upright so that when they fall down onto whatever it is you're grassing, you're left with an absolutely wild looking little grassy field. With my grass in place, I'll add a bit of color variation by dropping some tiny foam scatter flock onto the grass and pressing it down. Once I'm happy with the grassy base, I can slap my stones back in place. Finally, I'll paint the tops of the stones with a very thin PVA and water mix, then sprinkle a liberal amount of green foam flock over the top. Then I'll mist it all with an unhealthy amount of isopropyl alcohol and lock it in place with a little bit more thinned out PVA glue. A few hours later, my glue is dry enough and I can get to work adding the portal lights. Now, I'd considered practicing my soldering skills by making my own ring of LEDs to put in the base, but then I realized that I don't want to do that, so instead I pilfered this set of string lights from my Christmas decorations, which means technically that this little lamp is a Christmas light as well. It does mean though that I need to run 5 meters worth of pre-wired string lights through the bottom of my base and attach it to a circle around the entire surface. This is where some double-sided tape would have been perfect, but I don't have any, so instead I used duct tape and glue, and honestly I think it worked pretty well. Then it's just a case of making sure the lights are facing upwards and there aren't any big spaces between them, and that's kind of it, which means we're on to the final steps, starting with giving the lamb and his tentacles a bit of color. Because I made them all out of colored clay, there isn't much I need to do, but I want to give the underside of the tentacles a bit of a different color, so I'll paint them beige, followed by a darker brown wash, and then the green sections will get a dusting of greener green fading out from the center. I'll give the lamb a quick white once over to clean up his fluff, then I can add the trim to his poncho following those predetermined lines I made while I was sculpting, and then I can give the bell a little bit of black between the lines. I'll add a little UV resin to his eyes later to help shine them up a bit, but he's otherwise finished and ready to be put in place, which means it's time to demold the portal. And if I don't say so myself, that turned out pretty good. Now the silicone leaves a pretty flat surface, but I can fix that easily by brushing it all with a thin layer of UV resin. Then all that's left to do is assemble my various pieces, starting by running the wiring through the base, then gluing my lamb in place. Then I can run the wire through the hole in the bottom and press the portal into the foam. Now I've rounded out the edges of the portal so that I can get a nice firm friction fit, and I can remove it if I need to fix the lighting later. The eyes are hooked up to a battery pack while the base is connected via USB. Now I tried to connect the eyes to the end of the base lights, but they didn't provide enough power to give me the effect I was going for, and at this point I don't feel like trying to rewire anything, so a couple bits of duct tape will hold it in place and I can attach the remaining tentacles. However, with them in place, we're finished here, and on to the Glamour Shots. As always, a huge thank you to my wonderful patrons who continue to support me through my myriad of poor financial decisions, and a very special thank you to my newest patrons, Tilia C, Boone Girl, Beth Crane, David Yarbrough, Fabrizio Longino, Kensby00, CJ and Duck, Fleeny, Wolfie Bloodpaws, Justin Drew, Roberto Leonart, Living Decay. If I change my name to something clever, then maybe someone will read it. Sean B, Jenny, GLI1 Code 11A, Noah Pettibon, Polynomia, Pixel Arbiter, Lucky the Calico, Chubby Chew, Legalize Ranch 2040, Swabby, Piers Baker, and Will. You are the questionably placed demonic tentacles that help to hold this channel up. If you like this video, then go check out Cult of the Lamb. The developers actually reached out to me about a month ago and asked if I'd do a sponsored video for them, but I'm exceptionally bad at my job and I forgot to get back to them, which means that this isn't actually a sponsored video, it's just an homage to a ridiculous game that I think is just neato. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.